Salamun alaikum. So today I want to talk about some really amazing insights in the story of Musa or Moses in the Quran, especially with reference to Surah Al-Qasas, Surah 28. And I want to show like how much depth and psychology we can find in the Quran. The Quran touches on so many different things. So today what we're going to explore is how five women in the story of Musa helped to take down a toxic man, a tyrant that we know in the Quran as Fir'aun or Pharaoh. So if we start off by looking at all of the women in the story of Musa, it's really interesting. What's the connection of all the women in the story of Musa? So if we look at, for example, the mentions of his mother in the Quran, she's mentioned right after Allah speaks about how he is going to show Fir'aun, Pharaoh, Haman, and their armies, their soldiers, what they fear. Listen to these verses. He says, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا. Allah says, and this is in 28:5. He says, and we wanted or intended to bestow our grace upon those who are ustud'ifu. So we could roughly translate ustud'ifu as that they were considered to be or sought to be weakened. We're going to talk about this word and this concept a little bit more in this class today, inshallah. Inshallah, the concept of istid'af. When people seek to weaken others, seek to weaken their resistance or make them play small. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But here he says, Allah says that we wanted to bestow our grace and our favor upon those who this was done to. They were sought to be weakened. Fil ard, in the land. وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً. And we wanted to make them imams. We wanted to make them a'imma. We wanted to make them leaders. So Allah wanted to take people who were disempowered and empower them. وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ الْوَارِثِينَ. And we wanted to make them the inheritors. And then he goes on to say in verse 6, وَنُمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And we wanted to establish them in the land. We wanted to give them temkeen, establishment, empowerment in the land, after they were people who were weakened. وَنُرِيَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا مِنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَحْذَرُونَ. And we wanted to show Fir'aun and Haman and their armies from amongst them what they used to fear. Now, after he tells us his irada, because he says nuridu, we intended to, we wanted to. So his irada, what he intended or wanted to do, which was to bestow his grace upon those who had been oppressed and weakened. He then tells us that he was going to establish them in the land and show Fir'aun and Haman what they used to fear. And then immediately after that, in the next verse, in verse 7, what's the first thing he says? How is he going to show Fir'aun and Haman what they used to fear, or what they used to be? Actually, yahdarun is not just what they used to fear. Hadar is vigilance, awareness, being aware of some danger. So ma kanu yahdarun is he wanted to show them what they were on the lookout for already. They were looking out for someone that was going to take them down, perhaps is what it means. And in the very next verse, in verse 7, he says, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ أُمِّ مُوسَى أَنْ أَرْضِعِي. And we inspired or revealed to the mother of Musa an ardi'i, to suckle or to nurse him, Musa. So in the very next verse, right after he speaks about showing Fir'aun and Haman what they used to fear, in the very next verse, the first thing he references is not Musa himself, but the mother of Musa. وَأَوْحَيْنَا. He didn't say وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى Musa. We inspired Musa. He said وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ Musa. So the story starts from his mother, subhanallah. And then if we keep reading, we see what happens next. He tells, the inspiration comes to his mother, فَإِذَا خِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ فَأَلْقِيهِ فِي الْيَمِّ. So when you fear for him, throw him in the sea. So you have to let him go. You have to throw him in the sea. And actually that's a really beautiful thought, or a really beautiful lesson. Just as a side point, in order to keep something, sometimes you have to let go. And sometimes in life, we try to just continuously hold on to things. We're afraid to lose things. But here, this verse shows us that sometimes the way to keep something, the way to have things in life, is to develop a state of healthy detachment, to not be so attached to trying to hold on to everything, to just let things flow organically and then trust Allah's plan when it comes to those things. So if we skip a little bit and we go down, who picked him up from the sea? It tells us فَالْتَقَطَهُ آلُ فِرْعَوْنَ. The followers and people of Fir'aun picked him up. Obviously, Fir'aun is his enemy, right? Not yet, he's a baby, but eventually will become one of his ops. So, who saved him in this situation? When we go to verse 9, وَقَالَتِ امْرَأَةُ فِرْعَوْنَ قُرَّةُ عَيْنٍ لِي وَلَكَ. It was the wife of Fir'aun. The wife of Fir'aun ends up saying, he might be the coolness of the eye for me and you. The coolness of the eye, like a source of comfort. He might become a source of comfort for me and you. So she makes a suggestion. She says, لا تقتلوه. Don't kill him. عسى أن ينفعنا. Perhaps he might benefit us. أو نتخذه ولدا. Or we would adopt him or take him as a child. وهم لا يشعرون. While they are unaware. So she makes this suggestion and saves Musa. So the second woman in the story is responsible for saving Musa, right? Then Musa's mother is experiencing some grief from the loss of her son. So the Quran tells us, وَأَصْبَحَ فُؤَادُ أُمِّ مُوسَى فَارِغًا. The heart of the mother of Musa became empty, right? And then, إِن كَادَتْ لَتُبْدِي بِهِ لَوْلَا أَن رَبَطْنَا عَلَى قَلْبِهَا. She was almost about to reveal his situation had we not رَبَطْنَا عَلَى قَلْبِهَا, had we not tied her heart لِتَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, so she could be of the mu'mineen, of the believers, of those who find security in the promise of Allah. And then the next woman comes into play in the story. His mother, Musa's mother, tells his sister, وَقَالَتْ لِأُخْتِهِ قُصِّيهِ. And she said, Musa's mother, to his sister, قُصِّي, follow him closely. فَبَصُرَتْ بِهِ عَنْ جُنُوبٍ وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. So she watched him from the side while they were unaware. So now the third woman comes into the story, which is his sister, right? And then his sister ends up making a brilliant suggestion. Because Allah had a plan, so Allah made it so that Musa would not nurse from anyone except from his mother. So Allah says, وَحَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِ الْمَرَاضِعَ مِنْ قَبْلِ, that Allah forbade any other people, any other women that he would nurse from before. So this was already in the plan. فَقَالَتْ, so his sister ends up saying, هَلْ أَدُلُّكُمْ عَلَى أَهْلِ بَيْتٍ يَكْفُلُونَهُ لَكُمْ. Shall I not lead you to a household that will take care of him for you? وَهُمْ لَهُ نَاصِحُونَ. Well, they are very sincere well-wishers for him. So now his sister devises and develops a plan to return Musa back to his mother. So this is the third woman in the story that is responsible for helping to save and nurture Musa. And then if we read through the story, Musa goes through some events in his life. He ends up killing a person, and then he has to flee to Midian. But when he gets to Midian, what happened? So if we look to verse 23, the Quran tells us, وَلَمَّا وَرَدَ مَاءَ مَدْيَنَ. And when he arrived at the water of Midian, وَجَدَ عَلَيْهِ أُمَّةً مِّنَ النَّاسِ يَسْقُونَ. He found a group of people there. They were drawing water. وَوَجَدَ مِن دُونِهِمُ امْرَأَتَيْنِ تَذُودَانِ. And he found two women who were remaining back. قَالَ مَا خَطْبُكُمَا. He said, what is your situation? What is your affair? قَالَتَا لَا نَسْقِي حَتَّى يُسْدِرَ الرِّعَاء. They said, we don't draw water until the shepherds leave. So they were remaining back because the shepherds were in front of them. So maybe they were like weaker or in a vulnerable position. وَأَبُونَا شَيْخٌ كَبِيرٌ. And our father is a very old man, so he's not able to do that. So Musa فَسَقَى لَهُمَا. Musa drew the water for them. So he helped them. And in return, what happened? In the very next verse, فَجَاءَتْهُ إِحْدَاهُمَا تَمْشِي عَلَى اسْتِحْيَاءٍ. So one of them came walking modestly. قالت إن أبي يدعوك ليجزيك أجر ما سقيت لنا. He said, my father calls you in order that he may recompense you the reward of the water that you drew for us. So he might give you, he might pay you for what you did. And then when he came when Musa came to her father, فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُ وَقَصَّ عَلَيْهِ الْقَصَص, so when he came to him and he related to him the stories, قال لا تخف, he said, don't fear, نجوت من القوم الظالمين, you have been saved from the wrongdoing or oppressive people. And then one of the two women says, قالت إحداهما يا أبت استأجره إن خير من استأجرت القوي الأمين. One of them said, "O my father, employ him. Truly the best of those you employ is the strong and the trustworthy." So now, because he helped these two women, so these two women make 5 women in the story. His mother, the wife of Fir'aun, his sister, and these 2 women. And this woman suggested that to her father that she employs him and called him Al-Qawi Al-Amin, the strong and the trustworthy. So now, because he willingly and voluntarily helped these 2 women in a situation where they needed help, now one of them ended up getting him a job so he can survive, so he can support himself, right? And then in verse 27, the man at Madian says, قال إني أريد أن أنكحك إحدى بنتي هاتين على أن تأجرني ثمانية حجج. He says, I intend to marry you to one of my 2 daughters of these, on the condition that you work for me for 8 years. فإن أتممت عشرا فمن عندك. But if you complete 10, then that's something from your own self, right? And then Musa tells him in the next verse, قال ذلك بيني وبينك. He said, that is between me and you. أيما الأجلين قضيت فلا عدوان علي. Whichever of the 2 that I fulfill, then there's no harm, there's no transgression upon me. And then in the very next verse, it tells us, فَلَمَّا قَضَى مُوسَى الْأَجَلِ, when Musa finished the time period, وَسَارَ بِأَهْلِهِ, and he traveled with his family, آنَسَ مِنْ جَانِبِ الطُّورِ نَارًا, he perceived from the side of Tur, the Mount Tur, a fire, right? And this is when we come to the part of the story where Allah starts to speak to him, right? Because if we read down, we see that in verse 30 it tells us, فَلَمَّا أَتَاهَا, when he arrived at the fire, نُودِيَ مِنْ شَاطِئِ الْوَادِ الْأَيْمَنِ فِي الْبُقْعَةِ الْمُبَارَكَةِ مِنَ الشَّجَرَةِ أَيْ يَا مُوسَى إِنِّي أَنَا اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ, that he was called from the right side of the valley in the blessed spot of the tree, and Ya Musa, O Moses, Inni ana Allahu Rabbul Alameen, truly I am Allah, the Lord of Al-Alameen. So we see his path from the beginning of the surah up until when Allah spoke to him, starting with his mother, then the wife of Fir'aun, then his sister, then the 2 women at Madian, resulting in employment and resulting in a relationship, him getting married. And it was after that, it was after the path of these 5 women helping to direct him and to nurture him and to protect him and to get him employment and to get him married, right? It was after that that he finally made it to the spot in his life where Allah spoke to him and therefore started his mission to take down this tyrant who was the prime example of toxic masculinity. If you think about Pharaoh, and some of the things he did, for example, he said, "Ma alimtu lakum min ilahin ghayri." I don't know of any other God that you have except me. How much more toxic could you be as a man than to think you are God? And that's how a lot of men are trained to think. That's how a lot of us men in society are trained to think through our upbringing. Like, we are the ones in power. We are the ones that are running things. This woman needs to obey me, right? So we make ourselves like a god to them, right? Unfortunately, that's how we're trained, and that's something that we need to break. And that's something that the story of Musa can help us understand. That the people that we think are weak and vulnerable, or we're taught to believe are weak and vulnerable, are actually some of the strongest people in our lives and in society. And the Quran shows us how they helped to support Musa to bring down this tyrant. And one of the things that shows us that perhaps this is one of the themes of this surah is if we go all the way back to the beginning in verse 4. So verse 4 tells us, Inna Fir'auna ala fil ard. Truly Fir'aun elevated himself in the land, وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا, and he made its people into different groups and warring factions. يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ, he sought to weaken, and this is the concept we have to talk about more, istid'af. What does that mean? To seek to weaken something. Right? He sought to weaken a group from amongst them. يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ, he was slaughtering their sons. وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ, and he was allowing their women to live, slaughtering their sons and allowing their women to live. So he thought by allowing the women to live that this was safe for him, but it was actually the women that brought him down. In our next video, we're going to talk about the concept of istid'af. What does it mean to seek to weaken something psychologically, philosophically, in relationships, on the job? So if you haven't done it already, please like and subscribe so you can see that when I post it. Salamun alaikum.